Michelangelo's David is one of those pieces. It's almost a nodal piece, something that had to happen in the history of art. Had it not happened, it's hard to imagine what we would look back on as the Renaissance today, as central art in the Renaissance today. So the David originally would have stood outside Palazzo Vecchio, or the seat of government in Florence. And that's particularly important. Of course, today it no longer sits in this location. The one there is a copy. The original is in a museum. But that's important because here David would have looked to the south. He would have represented the Florentine people, seeing themselves as David against the Goliath, which was Rome and the papacy, something that they were constantly fighting against. They constantly saw themselves as the underdog. So the David perfectly symbolized that and sat outside the Palazzo Vecchio looking at their major enemy. Now, the piece itself has a bit of a story. Really, the stone that it's carved from has a story. It is said that the Opera del Duomo, the group that was in charge of building the cathedral in Florence, had purchased this massive marble stone. And it had been started by another sculptor who cut in a couple of large gouges into the stone. It's argued that that's part of the reason David stands the way he does. But then the sculptor did something or fell out of favor, and the stone stood there for quite some time until Michelangelo turns up and says, "Hey, I can carve that." And let me put this in context for you. At the time, Michelangelo is about 26 years old. And you're trusting this massive, beautiful marble block to this young kid who really hasn't done much when you think about it. Yes, he did the Pietà, but there's so much else that would normally go into it. So let's look at the David itself. First of all, when you look at the eyes, you'll notice they're a little unbalanced. They're actually slightly crossed. One is a little bit inside where it should be, the other one a little inside where it should be, and that has a purpose. What it does is it gives you the impression that he's actually following you, that the gaze is following you as you move around through this very large range of motion, which would make it that much more realistic, that much more interesting to look at. We also see the articulation of proportions. So we see, for example, the head is a little bit larger than we would expect, as well as the neck, the feet a little bit smaller. The reason it looks that way is, of course, it's meant to be on a plinth at an elevation. So by making the head larger when you're standing below it looking up, the head shrinks into proper proportion. The same thing Mantegna is doing with his foreshortened Christ, and something similar to what the Greeks had done. We also see the use of proportion and ratio based on the Greek model. So when we compare the David to the spear bearer, which is sort of the classic Greek example of perfect anatomy, you'll see that it is very, very similar. Arguably, the David is a little more realistic because Michelangelo is partaking in dissections and other experiments that the Greeks really are not dealing with at the time, at least not the artists. As we look at it, you'll notice that this is the moment before anything happens. He hasn't defeated Goliath at this point. In fact, this is tension coiled within the form. The moment is about to happen. David has yet to win. He's got the stone in his right hand and the sling in his left that he's going to use to defeat Goliath. And as he looks past us, he's looking at this unseen presence that seems to be behind the viewer, that's holding David's gaze. It gives us the impression that we are part of the scene, that we have entered into the composition itself. So here Michelangelo is moving from ideal beauty to pent-up emotion and tension in the moment. Now, yes, this is perfect proportion. There is a sense of idealism to it, but he's focusing not on the ideal body, but rather on the psychology. If you go back to the Greeks, your best example of this would be the Greek Hellenistic once again, looking at the defeated boxer or the dying Gallic chieftain, where you have this really perfect form, but then you add this element of emotion to it. And it creates this very powerful image, something that we all can look at and draw something from, because this is a man standing at the brink. He could find greatness or he could find death. And how many times do we go through that? How many times in your life, maybe not death, but you sit there and you feel like you're on the brink of a major decision and it's life-changing? And so the David captures something ubiquitous, something universal in the human experience that you can only capture by using the human nude, and only Michelangelo can capture it through the David.